I'm here with Real Story Group. I just wanted to get things started today with a couple of quick housekeeping items of note and then a brief introduction on Real Story Group. I do see a number of new names here in the webinar, so thanks for taking the time to join us and welcome to your first webinar. And for those that are repeats attendees, thanks again. It's for you that we put these webinars on together, and so we always appreciate your attendance and your attention, taking some time out of your day to join us. So welcome. And as we get started, you may notice that there is a questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel. So if you do have any questions or feedback during today's 30-minute session, you can enter those in, and Tony should be able to get to those by the end of the session today. And then for our customers on the line, you will be able to access a recording of today's presentation in your subscriber library. That'll be available within the next couple of days. And then for everyone that attends today's session, we'll be sending out the slides to you by the end of the week as well. So stay tuned for that. As we get started, I just want to talk a little bit about Real Story Group. This is our 20th year in existence, actually something we're very excited about to have our 20th anniversary. And Tony started the company actually as CMS Watch and has been following the web content management technology marketplace for 20 years. And what makes us unique versus some of the other analyst firms that you may be familiar with is the fact that we never work for or advise the vendors that we cover in any way. So you see the different products that we evaluate here on our omnichannel stack vendor map, some of the areas such as customer data platforms and journey orchestration engines. And today we're going to focus on the blue line of the map, the one that's got really the most vendors that we cover. It's the web content and experience management space. So Tony's going to take you through some trends to watch in that particular market over the next 30 minutes. And again, if you have questions, please enter those in. But for now, let me kick things over to Tony. Tony, all you.
Great. Thanks, Scott. And greetings, everyone, from where I live, which is Washington, D.C. in the United States. And a week ago today, on Wednesday, we had a fairly momentous day. I think whatever your political leanings, I think you'll agree that it will be known historically as a kind of a historic break point. As I think about making predictions and prognosticating about the web CMS marketplace every year over the last 20 years, there's always this temptation to say, hey, this is 2021 is going to be the year, the breakthrough, something is significant is going to happen. And what I've actually learned over these last 2 decades is that a lot of the trends that we see are actually multi-year trends. And so a number of things I'm going to talk to you about today are things that have been transpiring in the marketplace really over the past 2, 3, in some cases 5 years. But they have some significance in terms of what could transpire in 2021 and how you should think about it in 2021. So you won't see a kind of a 12-month prediction time frame here, but you will see some analysis of these trends and how they're evolving. So I wouldn't consider this, necessarily an inaugural year per se, but I think a significant year in the marketplace based on what we've seen, brewing over time. So we're going to focus on 4 main themes today. The first theme is going to be talking about the marketplace itself. And for the last 20 years that we've been watching web content management technology, evaluating web content management vendors, it has always been a highly fragmented marketplace. So that's not anything new. It will remain a fragmented marketplace, but it is evolving, and it's evolving in some significant ways. So here's our latest kind of logo chart of the marketplace, which is on a complexity spectrum. So a complexity spectrum here, roughly from left to right, is more complex to less complex. We think that this is the best way to break down the marketplace, which also subdivides, of course, by geography, by business model, by technology underpinning, so on and so forth. But we find that a complexity spectrum is the most useful way to sort of bucket the vendors. And there have been some changes in the past year. One thing that we've done here at Real Story Group is we dropped the far right, what used to be the far right category of kind of simpler products, a lot of those have been replaced now by some simpler, site maker type tools like Wix and others. And so we don't see much enterprise interest in these sort of lower end tools. So we're focusing more on what we describe as platforms. And by platform, it means that you typically need at least one developer, ideally two, to help you implement these solutions. So even said, though, there's still, and it's going to, of course, continue to be a spectrum of different platforms and a wide range of choices for you. So that's some continuity really in 2021. The other point of continuity here too is the legacy tools that you see grayed out in the lower left. These continue to fade out of the marketplace with respect to web content management. They still exist. You could think of them as kind of undead. And they're likely to continue to be undead in 2021. So again, kind of a point of continuity. There are some changes happening among the toolkits and upper range. So toolkits I'll get into next. We're seeing some significant rethinking about some of these relationships with these vendors and whether I've actually over-purchased here. In the upper range, we're seeing vendors really try to find different niches. They can't quite compete in terms of mind share or market share as some of the vendors above them or some of the vendors like WordPress below. But they remain significant players in the market and useful alternatives to the sort of toolkits. The other thing that we see in 2021 is a vibrant mid-market. We expect that market to change a little bit. Some of these players maybe to drop out of our evaluation, some new, more cloud-native solutions continuing to be added. So we expect that over the year. We've just added Content Stack. We're likely going to be adding others as well. But this remains a relatively vibrant part of the marketplace, even if none of these vendors themselves, with the exception maybe of WordPress and the Drupal community, are especially large and impactful. They do play an important niche in this environment, and they provide very useful alternatives to some of the more complicated tools that you see to the left. But I wanted to talk about what's happening with respect to the toolkits, and we've been seeing this really, some sort of pause and hesitation really over the last 3 years or so. And you see it in some of the things that are happening, for example, at Sitecore. We've seen it more recently in some of our subscribers exiting from Adobe AEM. While we know many of you are doubling down on your investment, in some cases we're beginning to see questions about whether this is really a kind of proper sunk cost. And so we think that there are more organizations sort of rethinking their WCM investments. And there's a broader context here too that I'll get into in a little bit later, but really trying to right-size your WCM investments, relative to other digital needs. And as we get better and better about marketing attribution, more and more questions are getting asked about how much do we invest in WCM relative to things like e-commerce, outbound engagement, social engagement, and other things. And of course, content is still critical to any experiences. So content management will always be important, but does that mean that we need a truly heavyweight, super complicated, personalization heavy WCM, particularly when the mid-market can do 80% or more of what the upper tier vendors can do? The other thing that we're seeing is a lot of relationship frustration with MarTech suite vendors. So in this context, it would be certainly Adobe, Microsoft, Salesforce, which doesn't really have much of a WCM presence, but some issues there where there's a bit of a dissonance between what those vendors are saying and what they're actually delivering. And in particular, we're seeing some of these vendors like Adobe really kind of convert some of their relationships from being consultative to more transactional, and really pushing platform solutions into places where the real problem is not necessarily platform related, or where the customer would be better served by a more best of breed type solution. My colleague Jared wrote an article about this, Beware MarTech Vendor Bullying. We're seeing quite a bit of this, and also, but more interestingly, particularly in the tail end of the pandemic, and now as hopefully we are coming out of it, more and more enterprises kind of pushing back against this. So I think part of this great pause that's happening is really a desire to get simpler at the engagement tier, to lose some of the technical debt that's associated with some of these heavyweight platforms and take a more agile approach, certainly simpler, cheaper approach to addressing WCM, and then keeping some of your powder dry or some of your resources available for some of the collateral needs that you need around implementation, optimization, and certainly outbound engagement in these times where, in particular, we don't have as much, face-to-face time with our customers and clients. So we're predicting a kind of a little bit more flattening of the marketplace. The other big issue that's been in the air really since the inception of WebCMS is this notion of multi-channel. Now, I think we think of it in terms of omni-channel, and what the pandemic, of course, has done is called into question these are kind of channel-specific engagement strategies, and now we're all looking to become more omni-channel. What does that mean? That's obviously a multi-year journey, but in particular, what does this mean with respect to web content management? So we have some reference models that kind of guide our thinking around this that I wanted to share with you. But first, let's take a little bit of a historical tour. When we look at this reference model that we had when we first started CMS Watch for what a web CMS did, was that it was kind of a content in, content out type framework. And from the very beginning, CMS tools were designed to be multi-channel. In other words, the idea was that you could ideally output things into PDFs, into XML for syndication. Some of you may remember wireless markup language or WML. And so CMS very often gave you the opportunity, by being able to decompose content and separate content from presentation, to be able to do this. It was clunky, but it very often did work. So this notion of being multi-channel is certainly nothing new. What's happened, though, over time is that rather than your CMS being central to this, it becomes more of just sort of one player in a larger stack. So this was the reference model that we had that we used in the 2010s, where you had a more layered approach with major channels at the top, and then interaction delivery services in the middle in the gray, and then you had this content and engagement management layer with the multicolored boxes at the bottom. And web content management was really just one piece of that, as we then needed to invest in digital asset management, certainly marketing automation and email service providers, and of course, social engagement. And so a lot of the effort that your enterprise invested in the 2010s was really modernizing and making these platforms more sophisticated, and hiring the people who could actually, and developing the relationships with outside suppliers that could actually get you there. But already we're getting the sense here that WCM is just one piece of the puzzle. Of course, what we learned increasingly towards the end of the decade was that customer data was really central to this. And so now we're in 2021. I think we reached a tipping point with respect to customer data platforms, where probably more than half of our subscribers actually have already deployed a CDP. And so what does that mean with respect to WCM, and what does that mean with respect to the WCM marketplace? So we think it's actually pretty significant. And so to that extent, we're going to introduce a kind of reference model. And we'll start with what we call the silo problem. So this is the natural outcome of this stack-specific, or this really channel-specific modernization that we were doing, where we were deploying all these different solutions for media, for web, for email, each that had their own content, their own data, their own rules and decisioning, their own planning subsystems, and their own analytic subsystems. And so we had these channel silos. Now, on the one hand, you do want to have some context in any channel, but on the other hand, it became impossible over time trying to integrate all these different things together. And so we think the answer for this in the 2020s, and we're already seeing we saw some significant progress last year with some of our more savvier enterprise subscribers, but we think this is going to be a multi-year journey, is really for an enterprise reference model where you have an integrated customer experience. In other words, where you take a customer-centric approach, which then by definition from a services perspective says, look, we need to abstract out or decouple some enterprise foundation services in this connection to be able to supply those services across any channel, including new ones that are bound to pop up in 2021. So having some omni-channel operations to govern all of this, unified customer data, really table stakes for this. Journey orchestration. So here's where personalization is going to reside rather than your web content management system. Customer data in a CDP rather than your web content management system. Omnichannel content. So this is a new class of content technology we're going to be talking about in a minute that may supplement or even replace your web content management system. And then analytics, reporting, and modeling, not just from a web traffic perspective, which you can get from Google Analytics or Adobe Analytics or something, similar, but true customer intelligence, which requires, enterprise data science. So what we've seen here really by nature of this is, reduced scope for WCM, or what some analysts call a digital experience platform. And by the way, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because again, what you really want to do is to be able to supply the right fitting capabilities, but then certain core services to be able to supply those across the enterprise. So this is the reference architecture model that we've proposed for the 2020s. And so you still have your engagement channels, your interaction delivery environments, certainly still some content and engagement management platforms, but then you have these enterprise foundation platforms that provide core enterprise services so you can take a more customer-centric approach as opposed to a channel-centric approach to these things. And so what happens here is, WCM from going what it was in the 2001 when I started Real Story Group as CMS Watch, WCM was sort of like the center of your digital universe. Now it's really just one piece of the overall puzzle. It is, to be sure, a really important piece, but you have to ask yourself, is this necessarily where I want to embed first of all, where I want to apply all of these resources, but secondly, is this the place where I want to embed and potentially trap a lot of functionality? The other question that this raises is, okay, some WCM vendors have been acquiring or building other tools. Are those the tools that you really want to provide that service? So I'm going to pick on Sitecore here for a second. Sitecore started as a WCM vendor. They made some acquisitions and built some tools around email marketing, social engagement, e-commerce. They acquired a DAM. They claim that they can do omnichannel content. They have a built-in quasi-CDP. They have their own personalization engine, and then they have their own quasi-intelligence hub. Once you get beyond WCM and DAM, most of these, first of all, are fairly substandard services. But secondly, even from an architectural perspective, do you really want to get all of these capabilities from a single platform, let alone a single vendor? If you're a smaller enterprise, maybe so. Certainly simplifies your life. If you're a larger enterprise, you want to build a more agile stack where you can plug in the right fitting tools for what you need. And fit really here is the key issue if you care about being successful and, quite frankly, if you care about your coworkers. So let's say you have a marketer and his job is every Friday he's got to drill a small hole in a piece of wood. So someone might come along and say, well, we already have this drill press from Salesforce. Let's just use that. And technically it will work, but is this really the way that you're going to be doing agile marketing? Well, probably not. So you need to, if you're going to be successful, if you're going to be agile, you really want the right fitting tools. And very often we find that means integrating more best of breed type solutions rather than buying an assemblage of capabilities from a single vendor that you're probably going to have to spend as much time integrating as you would best of breed anyway. So in a world where you're trying to be omnichannel and where you're trying to provide best fit for your marketers and for your customers, then you're going to look at a WCM platform for its capabilities with respect to WCM. You probably don't want to know or depend on it for being an effective email service provider for you. So there's another thing that we see coming this decade, and the advent of this is happening very slowly. We thought 2020 would be kind of a breakthrough year. It wasn't really. And so I think this is going to be really a multi-year journey. So I'm not going to say that 2021 is going to be a breakthrough year here. But what we are seeing is enterprise demand for what we're calling an omni-channel content platform. And so this is different from a web content management system, which is really about managing content primarily for your website and then some structured content for other applications. This is really an omnibus asset management repository where, yes, you can store text and copy, but also things like offers, images, video, audio, documents, micro experiences. And then it tracks where and how these items are assembled and where they're deployed. So these have to be technically fairly complex systems, both in terms of the diversity of the content types that they support and the way that they can support both component and compound assets. So it's a somewhat complex undertaking. There aren't a lot of solutions on our red line that can do this today, but we see some vendors moving in this direction. So the idea here is that, it provides core component asset management support, but driven primarily for marketing and engagement people, whereas historically component asset management was more of a kind of a technical documentation thing. Now this is really for marketers so that I could have some component assets that I might use on my website, but then adapt for use in my email. And I know that they're being used in both places. And they might be built on components of data and text and images, but I'm compounding them together into more compound assets by grouping them and then sort of understanding them both as a component asset and a compound asset. This is complicated stuff. We see a universal need for this, not always a universal ability to master a platform like this. And again, a somewhat sparse marketplace for these tools, but we think this is where things are going. So in a lot of cases, when we've been helping our subscribers with their roadmaps, we're saying, look, hey, this is something to think about in 2021. So you ought to be thinking about this, but you're probably not going to pull the trigger on this unless you're a fairly advanced customer here, which you may be. You're probably not going to pull the trigger on this until 2022 or 2023, but it's something to keep an eye on. Okay. The last word of the day is hybrid, and then we'll wrap this up. I'll remind you that you can feel free. We're already getting a couple questions in the Go to Meetings questions tab. Feel free to ask any questions, or if there's anything you agree with or you disagree with or you'd like to make a comment, you can do it. I won't mention your last name, just your first name, so you can do it semi-anonymously. If you want to participate that way, feel free to use the questions tab in your GoToWebinar control panel. So we've just put out some research around this. We think the watchword for WCM over the next several years, and 2021 is really going to confirm this, is the word hybrid. Hybrid both with respect to architecture and authoring. So when I say architecture, I don't mean hybrid in as much as like half on-prem, half in cloud. What I mean is hybrid, that it's both coupled experience delivery and content management as well as headless. So I was being able to do both. And then similarly in an authoring context, being able to manage both componentized text elements as well as do full page curation. So what we found is that customers, particularly larger enterprises across all their use cases, reasonably want to do both. So why not satisfy them in a single platform? So I think you all know what Headless is. Headless has become almost a kind of a religious precept. We find that tends to be more attractive to developers and architects, and marketers very often are somewhat skeptical of it. And I think we need to listen to their skepticism before we deploy this. But one of their concerns, which is a legitimate concern, is that there's certain environments where they do want control over the front end experience, and to be able to do that from the same environment where they're managing content. So how do they do this in a headless environment? Sometimes developers will say, well, don't worry your pretty little head about this. And that's not really the right way to treat your marketing and communications colleagues. So what ideally we have is the ability for marketers to manage content, but also in some cases manage pages. And then in other cases, just manage content fragments or experience fragments that can be deployed elsewhere, the way that a headless system can do. This is, for too long, this has been a kind of a religious discussion, and this isn't really a theological issue at all. This is a business issue. And so if your vendor is firmly on one side or the other, they're probably not a good long-term partner for you. We're designating 2021 as the year of the hybrid WCM. Similarly, we're seeing mixed paradigms, not just architecturally, but also with respect to editorial and syndication. So, we've seen the rise of these kind of medium style editors, including in WordPress and others, that, bring a lot more editorial fluidity back into the process, where you can do kind of block-based editing, paragraph by paragraph. And so that's very good. Anything that can empower editorial creativity and freedom and usability is inherently a good thing. There are some issues about whether these blocks are addressable or not. In other words, is this truly structured content? And I'll come back to that in a second. But in addition to this kind of block style editing, there's also needs in some cases for page management, page level curation. We're seeing with the rise of content strategies and experience strategies, very often a legitimate desire to do page or screen-based curation as opposed to just managing content, tossing it out there and hoping that it's going to show up the way that you hoped it would. And so you don't want to do that in every context, but there are some contexts where this is very important. Yet at the same time, and this speaks more to some extent to the more componentized, potentially headless model, there are times when you need structured content that could be reused in various different channels or various different venues. And so we're seeing the emergence of hybrid authoring models. It's a little bit tricky here. The industry isn't quite where we might want it to be as authors and editors. Sometimes these are two different editorial systems within the same platform. That's okay. Sometimes you have to pre-decide whether something is going to be structured or not. That's not always okay. But we're getting there, I think, in terms of being able to marry the fluidity with the curation, with the optional syndication of that content. And so 2021, I think, is where we'll see a lot more hybrid editorial environments as well. There's still also that interesting case, are we trying to do content as a service or micro experiences as a service? This is a complicated issue. Content as a service, most vendors have mastered, maybe not always as well as we'd like. But experience as a service, I think, is the next real frontier, that I've got a micro experience that I might want to be able to place within an environment where I'm not controlling the entire screen. There's a lot of issues here around clashes, namespace violations, UX dissonance, and other sorts of things. But we've been watching this for a while, and I think we're going to see over the next couple of years a lot of interest in marketing people being able to not just syndicate content fragments, but experience fragments as well. A lot of the issues around that are semi-technical, but really a lot more really about governance more than anything else. Okay. So the WCM marketplace is fragmented, but it is compressing a little bit. The good news is, though, you still have a lot of choices. There are cautions that we're giving you around the very top and the very bottom of the market, very top, where we are seeing a lot of overinvestment and vendors that are dragging you into architectures that no longer make sense, and at the bottom of the market that has become largely commoditized. You do have an opportunity and maybe even an obligation to lighten your footprint at the WCM tier, and there are any number of modern alternatives that can help you do that, both lighten with respect to the architectural heaviness of the platform, but also the overall expense. So you can be spending money on things like people who maybe prove more critical to your success. You really want to apply design thinking to tech selections if you want solutions that will really work for your team. So don't just give someone a drill press because they need to put a hole in the wood. Instead, really understand what your marketers are trying to do and then apply the solution for them. And that may mean parting ways with some of your larger vendor partners. And what this also means is really avoiding architectural purity when it comes to WCM. And so by that, I mean, don't just default to a tightly coupled system, or more commonly say that, that to be modern, you have to have a fully headless WCM. We've seen some real regrets for people who leapt into the headless pool when they really weren't the right candidate for it. So headless as an architectural model makes sense in many contexts, but it's an architectural model. It shouldn't be a vendor strategy per se. So here's how you can contact us going forward, and I'll turn it over to Scott to give you some final thoughts here while I take a look at some of the questions that have come in.
Great, thanks, Tony. It does look like there are a number of questions, so we'll get to those momentarily. But in the meantime, I can definitely direct you over to our website where you can download an excerpt from the research that we offer on web content management that was just recently updated by Tony and the rest of the analyst team here. And you can also try out the tools that we offer as part of our customer experience. So for those of you that may be evaluating vendors in this space, you can use those tools to create your own custom shortlist based on your particular use cases, and then see a side-by-side comparison of those vendors. And if you ever want to see a demonstration of what would be available to you as a Real Story Group customer, you can just email us at explore@realstorygroup.com, and we'd be happy to set up a 20-minute overview of the site. So I will turn things back to Tony, as there are a number of questions that have come in. Tony?
Yeah, Aaron is asking, in connection with the Sitecore example that I gave, what is a smaller versus a larger enterprise, and does that affect how you source many parts versus best of breed? So, we tend to be biased towards best of breed just based on what we have seen out there in the marketplace, but at the same time, it's the sort of thing that typically we find more suitable the larger the enterprise you are, where you have the architectural skills and the resources to put these pieces together. It's no accident that in the small and medium-sized business, you tend to see more multi-function type solutions, things that bundle a lot of different services in one thing, and then that makes it easier both to procure and then to operate and run, or have somebody else operate and run on your behalf. So what constitutes a small versus a large enterprise is up to anybody's guess here. We've certainly seen some smaller vendors some smaller enterprises that are digital native that behave like large enterprises because digital is their only business, right? And so their MarTech spend is orders of magnitude larger than another small firm. But typically, when we say large enterprise, we mean, something with on the order of hundreds of millions or billions of dollars in revenue, more than one country, potentially more than one product or business model, so on and so forth. And those are the ones where you have to be careful about having a vendor decide your architecture for you. And that's my big issue with Salesforce and Oracle and Microsoft and Adobe, is that they're trying to tell you what your architecture should be and shape it in a way that's amenable for them to sell their tools, as opposed to you independently having business drivers for your enterprise architecture, which to me is the only way to do this in this coming customer-centric decade. Declan is asking a very interesting question that we get quite frequently, which is, in terms of the MarTech stack, is this not a significant integration challenge? Do you feel the type of architecture has been achieved successfully in customer deployments? And yes, this is a significant integration challenge. We have no choice here. Even if you sourced everything all from Salesforce, you would still have a significant integration challenge: data integration, event integration, process integration, compliancy at an enterprise level. There's any number of issues. And so this is our life. I mean, we can pretend that there's no complexity there, but there is. And so simply to be effective and to be a leader, and if you have notions of digital transformation, you have to kind of lean into that complexity. There are ways to certainly simplify your life by making sure that you reduce service overlaps, that you have really strong enterprise architecture strategy, that a lot of your models focus on reusability and so on and so forth. And so we get called into a lot of places where the issue is not so much the complexity, but the sheer volume of tools and the messiness that's there. And so just sorting these things out with using proper service boundaries and that sort of thing can significantly simplify your life. But, is MarTech all about integration? I'd be inclined to say 90% yes. Jonathan is asking, let's see, do I consider Elementor as a medium style editor? Yeah, I would say so. I don't necessarily have a lot of experience with that, but there's a number of these things out there, some, including some open source things and some RTEs, and then vendors who have built their own editors. So I think this kind of innovation is a good thing. The key thing is to make sure that you do usability testing before you sign off on behalf of your actual editors. And so we have some other questions around that as well. Bradley, do you see a particular vendor that have any examples of experience as a service as a micro level done well? a lot of vendors can vend these sorts of things, either as JavaScript components or have API calls that can not just capture the content itself, but an experience fragment. I think so most of the tools we cover have some story here. Some are a little bit more transparent than others. The bigger question really is around governance and security and performance, and in governance, then creating really clear UX standards about this, so that there's no surprises in terms of what the end user sees. Craig is saying, what do you think of the suggestion that integrating best-of-breed MarTech tools to APIs can lead to inconsistent experiences for customers or systems managers as a response of different server response times or UI differences? Is this a legitimate trade-off? So what I would say is, I don't believe that this is a multi-vendor versus single vendor trade-off. In other words, if you got everything from Salesforce, you would still have potential latency issues. A lot of these tools were built by different vendors. You would still have different UX paradigms, both on the management side as well as the customer-facing side. So, these are evergreen issues, whether you're going with a single vendor or multiple vendors. You have to deal with technical issues like latency, and user experience issues like consistency. And so, these are more, to my mind, more governance issues rather than vendor procurement issues. Let's see. How do you compare OCP to something like a content hub that gather content? Well, that's a good question. I think there are some content operations platforms that kind of serve as OCPs, in as much as they're trying to aggregate and help you bring content together in kind of a pre-publication process. So these used to be called content marketing platforms, sometimes content operation platforms. And I think, Bradley, the difference is that those systems are they're pretty good at managing the workflow and creative process and some of the operational processes around aggregating and then syndicating that content. What they're typically not very good at is managing heterogeneous content components, including assets, data, and content at an atomic level, enabling you to do arbitrary compounding and that sort of thing, and then integrating with reporting systems so you can understand where it's used. These become very sophisticated, difficult engineering challenges, quite frankly. These have to be very object-oriented platforms, and that's one of the reasons why you haven't seen very many vendors do this well. And so the simpler kind of content marketing, content operations platforms largely aren't there yet because the repositories aren't built for this. Okay, we have 10 minutes ago run out of time, so thank you for indulging 40 minutes of what was supposed to be a 30-minute webinar. We've got some great questions there. Once again, feel free to go to our website, download our WCM evaluation, which actually, the free evaluation is actually a Sitecore. So if you want to know what we really think about Sitecore, feel free to download it. And feel free to reach out to my friend and colleague, Scott, who can help you understand how we can make you more effective in 2021. So for Scott and I, best wishes from Real Story Group. See you next time. Bye now.